If you think small towns are safe havens where everyone knows everyone and monsters only exist in nightmares, then the story of what happened in Millbrook, Tennessee will destroy every assumption you have ever made about trust, community, and the predators who hide behind the most innocent faces. Before we dive into this shocking true story that will leave you questioning everyone in your neighborhood, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because what you are about to discover about a beloved teacher and the decade-long deception that terrorized an entire community will change how you see the people around you forever. In the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee, where morning mist clings to mountain peaks and church bells mark the rhythm of Sunday worship, Millbrook stood as America's idealized version of small-town perfection. Population 4,200 souls, who took pride in unlocked doors, children walking safely to school, and Friday night football games that brought the entire community together under stadium lights that illuminated more than just high school athletics. They revealed a way of life that felt increasingly rare in modern America. Sarah Elizabeth Morgan had been the third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary for 18 years. Her classroom on the second floor, overlooking the playground where generations of children had learned their first lessons about friendship, competition, and the gentle disappointments that shape young hearts. At 39, she possessed the rare gift of making every 8-year-old feel special, whether she was helping shy Tommy Henderson find his voice during reading time or encouraging brilliant but restless Madison Parker to channel her energy into creative writing projects. Sarah's apartment on Maple Street sat just 4 blocks from the school, a comfortable walk that took her past the hardware store where old men gathered each morning to solve the world's problems, and the diner where waitress Betty Collins had been serving coffee and gossip in equal measure for over 20 years. Sarah loved these morning walks, the predictable rhythm of small-town life, the way storekeepers waved from behind plate glass windows, and how even the stray dogs seemed to recognize her as part of the community fabric. What made Millbrook particularly special was its sense of collective responsibility. Parents knew they could trust any adult in town to look after their children. Teachers, coaches, shopkeepers, and neighbors formed an interconnected web of care that made formal childcare arrangements almost unnecessary. It was the kind of place where a lost 6-year-old would be safely returned home within minutes, where teenagers who made poor choices faced community-wide disappointment that hurt worse than any legal consequences. But on that crisp October morning in 2014, when Principal James Morrison arrived at Millbrook Elementary to find Sarah Morgan's classroom empty, and her car sitting in the parking lot with the engine still running, the foundation of everything this community believed about safety and trust began to crack in ways that would never fully heal. The thing about small towns is that secrets travel faster than wildfire, especially when they involve people everyone knows and trusts. Sarah Morgan wasn't just another teacher. She was the woman who had taught half the town's children, who had been there for Christmas pageants and graduation ceremonies, who had comforted families through difficult times and celebrated achievements both large and small. Her disappearance sent shock waves through a community that had never experienced anything more violent than the occasional bar fight or domestic dispute that could be resolved with stern conversations and community pressure. Detective Michael Torres had transferred to Millbrook from Memphis 3 years earlier, seeking the peace and quiet that only rural Tennessee could provide. After 15 years of investigating gang violence, drug trafficking, and urban homicides, he had grown accustomed to the gentle pace of small-town policing, where the most serious calls involved teenagers drinking beer behind the Methodist church or occasional property disputes between neighbors who had been feuding over fence lines for decades. The crime scene at Millbrook Elementary challenged everything Torres thought he understood about rural law enforcement. Sarah's classroom showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no indication that violence had occurred within the school building itself. But her personal belongings remained scattered across her desk, as if she had been interrupted in the middle of preparing for another ordinary day. Her lesson plans for the following week lay open to a unit on colonial America. Her coffee cup still held lukewarm liquid, and her purse sat in the locked drawer where she kept it every morning before greeting her students. What made the scene even more disturbing was the complete absence of explanation. Sarah Morgan simply was not there. Her car keys remained on her desk, her coat, hung on the back of her chair, and her cell phone showed no missed calls or text messages that might indicate where she had gone. The only unusual element was the school's side door, which had been propped open with a small rock, something that violated school security policies. But that might have seemed innocent to someone who knew the building well. The initial canvass of the neighborhood revealed the maddening reality of small-town investigations. Everyone loved Sarah, everyone trusted her, and no one could imagine who might want to harm a third-grade teacher who spent her spare time volunteering at the animal shelter and organizing book drives for underprivileged children. The closest thing to an enemy that anyone could identify was Harold Peterson, the parent of a student who had been disciplined for behavioral problems, but even that conflict had been resolved through a parent-teacher conference that left both parties satisfied. Torres found himself investigating not just a disappearance but the systematic destruction of a community's faith in its own safety. Within hours of Sarah being reported missing, parents began arriving at the school to collect their children early. Restaurants and shops that normally stayed open late began closing their doors and locking them for the first time in years. The easy trust that had defined Millbrook for generations was replaced by a hypervigilance that would never fully disappear. The search for Sarah Morgan expanded beyond the town limits within 24 hours, involving state police, bloodhounds, and volunteers from surrounding counties who combed through forests, streams, and abandoned buildings within a 50-mile radius. But eastern Tennessee terrain, with its dense woods, rocky outcroppings, and hidden caves, could conceal secrets for generations. The landscape that made Millbrook beautiful also provided countless locations where evidence could be hidden beyond the reach of even the most thorough searches. As 48 hours passed without any trace of Sarah, Torres began to suspect that her disappearance was not random, that whoever had taken her possessed intimate knowledge of her routines, her vulnerabilities, and the school's security procedures. The level of planning required to make a woman vanish without leaving any meaningful evidence suggested someone who understood both Sarah and the community well enough to predict how the investigation would unfold. Detective Michael Torres had worked hundreds of missing person cases during his career in Memphis, but Sarah Morgan's disappearance felt fundamentally different from the moment he walked through the empty hallways of Millbrook Elementary. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on displays of children's artwork that suddenly seemed ominous in the context of their teacher's mysterious absence. Torres understood that the first 72 hours were critical in any missing person investigation, but he also knew that small-town cases presented unique challenges that urban investigators rarely encountered. The Millbrook Police Department consisted of Chief Robert Anderson Torres and 2 part-time officers who normally dealt with traffic violations and minor property crimes. The department's evidence storage consisted of a single filing cabinet, and their forensic capabilities extended no further than basic fingerprint powder and a camera that had been state-of-the-art in the 1990s. Torres found himself coordinating with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation while trying to manage community expectations and media attention that was growing by the hour. Sarah's daily routine had been predictable to the point of ritual. She arrived at school each morning at 7:15, exactly 30 minutes before the first bell unlocked her classroom, and spent the time preparing materials for the day's lessons. Her schedule was known not just to fellow teachers and administrators, but to parents, custodial staff, and the delivery drivers who brought supplies to the school. Anyone who had observed the building during morning hours would have known precisely when Sarah would be alone and vulnerable. The school's security system consisted of basic door alarms that were rarely activated during daylight hours, and a single camera that monitored the main entrance but not the side door that had been found propped open. The lack of comprehensive surveillance was typical for rural schools in 2014, but it meant that investigators had no visual record of Sarah's final moments or any potential abductor who might have accessed the building. Tours interviewed every staff member at Millbrook Elementary, discovering that Sarah had seemed completely normal during the previous week's faculty meeting. She had volunteered to coordinate the upcoming Halloween festival and had been excited about a new reading program she wanted to implement. Her relationships with colleagues were uniformly positive, and none of them could identify any source of stress or conflict in her personal life. The custodian, James Bradley, had opened the building at 6:30 that morning, following the same routine he had maintained for over a decade. Bradley reported nothing unusual about the building or grounds, and confirmed that all doors had been properly secured when he left the previous evening. The maintenance records showed no scheduled repairs or visits from outside contractors that might have provided cover for an intruder. Sarah's personal life proved equally difficult to investigate. She lived alone in her Maple Street apartment, maintaining the kind of orderly existence that teachers often cultivated during the school year. Her social circle consisted primarily of fellow educators, church members, and volunteers at the animal shelter, where she spent most Saturday mornings helping care for abandoned pets. Her romantic relationships had been limited to a brief engagement 3 years earlier that had ended amicably when her fiancé accepted a job transfer to another state. The ex-fiancé, David Mitchell, was contacted at his current home in Nashville and cooperated fully with the investigation, providing phone records and travel documentation that confirmed he had been at work during the time Sarah disappeared. Mitchell expressed genuine shock and concern about Sarah's fate, describing her as the most responsible and safety-conscious person he had ever known. Their relationship had ended without acrimony, and they had maintained occasional contact through social media. Tours expanded the investigation to include registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius of Millbrook, discovering that rural eastern Tennessee was home to more individuals with concerning criminal histories than most residents realized. The sex offender registry revealed dozens of men with convictions for crimes against women and children living in isolated areas where monitoring was difficult and community awareness was limited. One name that caught Tours' attention was Raymond Baker, a 45-year-old convicted rapist who had been released from prison 18 months earlier and was living in a trailer park approximately 20 miles from Millbrook. Baker's criminal history included multiple assaults against women and a pattern of targeting victims who lived alone or worked in isolated locations. His parole officer confirmed that Baker had been complying with reporting requirements, but acknowledged that supervision of rural parolees was less intensive than in urban areas. The interview with Baker took place at the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office, where Tours was joined by investigators from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Baker appeared nervous and evasive when questioned about his whereabouts during the morning Sarah disappeared, claiming he had been at home alone watching television, but unable to provide specific details about programs or activities that would corroborate his alibi. Baker's trailer was searched with his reluctant consent, revealing living conditions that suggested mental instability and obsessive behavior. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about crimes against women and law enforcement officers, and his personal computer contained disturbing searches related to abduction techniques and body disposal methods. However, no physical evidence connected Baker to Sarah's disappearance, and his vehicle showed no signs of recent cleaning or damage. While Baker remained under surveillance, the investigation continued to expand, with particular attention paid to anyone who might have had access to Millbrook Elementary or knowledge of Sarah's routines. The list included current and former school employees, maintenance contractors, substitute teachers, and regular volunteers, all of whom were interviewed and asked to account for their whereabouts during the relevant time period. The breakthrough Tours had been hoping for came from an unexpected source when a highway department worker reported seeing a suspicious vehicle parked near a remote section of State Route 47 during the early morning hours of October 15. The worker Timothy Nash had been conducting routine road maintenance when he observed a dark-colored pickup truck with its hood raised as if experiencing mechanical problems. What made the sighting significant was the vehicle's location approximately 15 miles from Millbrook Elementary on a seldom-used stretch of highway that connected to several unpaved logging roads leading deep into the surrounding forest. Nash described the driver as a middle-aged white male who had appeared nervous when offered assistance and had claimed his vehicle was overheating despite cool morning temperatures. The area where Nash had observed the suspicious vehicle became the focus of an intensive search involving state police helicopters, thermal imaging equipment, and volunteer search teams coordinated by the Rutherford County Emergency Management Agency. The terrain was challenging with steep ridges, dense undergrowth, and abandoned mine shafts that could easily conceal evidence. The search continued for 5 days without discovering any trace of Sarah or her abductor. Tours began to suspect that the pickup truck sighting was connected to Sarah's disappearance, but without a license plate number or more specific vehicle description, the lead proved impossible to pursue effectively. The investigation had generated dozens of tips and potential sightings, but none had provided the breakthrough needed to locate Sarah or identify her abductor. As days turned into weeks, the case began to take on the characteristics of a classic cold case. The disappearance of Sarah Morgan transformed Millbrook from a community where parents felt comfortable letting their children walk to school alone into a place where every stranger was viewed with suspicion, and every unexplained absence triggered panic. The psychological impact extended far beyond Sarah's immediate circle of colleagues and friends to encompass entire families who had trusted her with their children's education and emotional development. Millbrook Elementary implemented emergency security measures within days of Sarah's disappearance, including mandatory identification checks for all visitors, locked entrances during school hours, and constant adult supervision for students who had previously been allowed to move freely between classrooms and common areas. The changes were necessary, but they fundamentally altered the atmosphere of a school that had prided itself on maintaining the kind of open, nurturing environment where children could feel safe and supported. Sarah's third-grade classroom remained exactly as she had left it, with student work still displayed on bulletin boards and lesson plans spread across her desk. Principal James Morrison made the decision to keep the room sealed while maintaining hope that Sarah would return to complete the school year. But as weeks passed without any word, the empty classroom became a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen their community. Substitute teachers struggled to maintain continuity in Sarah's absence, knowing they were following lesson plans created by someone whose fate remained unknown. The children asked daily when Miss Morgan would return, and their teachers found themselves providing reassurances they did not feel while trying to maintain educational routines that seemed increasingly hollow given the circumstances. The broader community experienced its own crisis of identity as the values that had defined Millbrook for generations came under scrutiny. Friday night football games continued, but parents found themselves scanning the stands for unfamiliar faces rather than focusing on their children's athletic achievements. The hardware store coffee klatch that had been a cornerstone of local social interaction became dominated by speculation about the investigation and theories about who might have been responsible for Sarah's disappearance. Local businesses suffered as residents became reluctant to venture out after dark or to patronize establishments where they might encounter strangers. The diner where Sarah had eaten lunch every Wednesday saw its regular customers looking over their shoulders and engaging in hushed conversations about security, rather than the usual gossip about school board meetings and church social events. Religious leaders found themselves struggling to provide comfort and guidance to congregations that were grappling with fundamental questions about divine protection and human evil. Pastor William Clark at Millbrook Methodist Church, where Sarah had been an active member for over 15 years, delivered sermons about maintaining faith during times of trial, but privately wondered how to reconcile his belief in God's benevolence with the reality that evil had touched their sanctuary. The investigation consumed resources that Millbrook had never needed to allocate for criminal matters. The police department's annual budget was exhausted within 2 months of Sarah's disappearance as overtime costs communications equipment and coordination with state agencies strained finances that had been designed to handle routine municipal services rather than complex criminal investigations. Parents began organizing their own security measures, including volunteer patrols that monitored school grounds during evening hours and weekend activities. Neighborhood watch programs that had never existed in a community, where everyone knew everyone else, and informal communication networks that tracked the movements of unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious individuals. The psychological toll was particularly severe on Sarah's students, who had lost not just a teacher but a trusted adult who had played a significant role in their emotional development. Child psychologists brought in from the regional medical center worked with families to address trauma symptoms, ranging from separation anxiety to sleep disturbances to aggressive behaviors that emerged as children struggled to process the loss of someone they had believed would always be there. Tommy Henderson, the shy 8-year-old who had blossomed under Sarah's encouragement, regressed to behaviors he had outgrown years earlier, refusing to speak in class and becoming clinically attached to his mother in ways that interfered with normal daily activities. His parents, Lisa and Mark Henderson, found themselves questioning every decision they had made about their son's safety and wondering what signs they might have missed that could have prevented the tragedy. Madison Parker, the gifted student who had thrived under Sarah's intellectual challenges, began acting out in ways that concerned her teachers and parents. Her creativity took on darker themes, and her previously cheerful disposition was replaced by anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms, including headaches and stomach problems that had no apparent medical cause. The ripple effects extended beyond immediate families to encompass the entire social fabric of Millbrook. Elderly residents who had lived in the community for decades began locking doors that had remained open for years, installing security systems, and avoiding activities that had once been routine parts of their daily lives. The garden club that Sarah had joined the previous spring disbanded when members became uncomfortable meeting in the community center that now felt isolated and vulnerable. Local government officials found themselves under pressure to increase law enforcement presence and improve emergency response capabilities, but the municipal budget could not support the kind of comprehensive security measures that frightened residents demanded. Mayor Patricia Williams faced criticism for the town's previous lack of investment in safety infrastructure, while defending decisions that had been reasonable given Millbrook's historical crime statistics. The media attention that Sarah's case attracted brought unwanted scrutiny to a community that valued privacy and independence. Reporters from regional television stations and newspapers descended on Millbrook, seeking interviews and background information that many residents were reluctant to provide. The coverage created additional stress as community members found themselves portrayed in ways that did not reflect their understanding of their own identity. Business leaders worried about the long-term economic impact as Millbrook's reputation for safety and quality of life was replaced by association with violent crime. Tourism and new business development that had been growing steadily began to decline as potential investors and visitors expressed concerns about security. Real estate values fluctuated as some residents considered leaving while others refused to sell homes that had been in their families for generations. The investigation itself became a source of division within the community as some residents criticized law enforcement response, while others defended the efforts being made to find Sarah and bring her abductor to justice. Conspiracy theories emerged suggesting cover-ups or incompetence, while more measured voices called for patience and continued support for professional investigators. Church attendance increased dramatically in the weeks following Sarah's disappearance as people sought comfort and community support, but religious services were marked by an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty that had never existed before. Prayers for Sarah's safe return became central elements of weekly worship, But as time passed without resolution, those prayers began to take on the characteristics of memorial services for someone who might never come home. School board meetings became forums for parents to express frustration about security measures and demand explanations for policies that had seemed adequate before Sarah's disappearance. The board found itself implementing expensive safety protocols while trying to maintain the educational environment that had made Millbrook Elementary a source of community pride. The seasonal rhythms that had always defined life in Millbrook continued, but with an overlay of anxiety that affected every community gathering. Halloween celebrations were scaled back, Christmas pageants included security measures that had never been necessary before, and spring festivals were planned with contingencies for emergency situations that had previously been unthinkable in such a peaceful setting. 6 months after Sarah Morgan's disappearance, Detective Michael Torres received a call that would reinvigorate an investigation that had been slowly dying from lack of evidence. A construction crew working on a highway expansion project near the remote area where the suspicious pickup truck had been spotted had discovered what appeared to be personal items buried beneath several feet of soil and debris. The discovery occurred during routine excavation for a drainage system, when heavy machinery operator Frank Davidson noticed fabric and what looked like leather protruding from recently disturbed earth. Davidson had lived in rural Tennessee long enough to understand that finding buried items in isolated locations could indicate criminal activity, and he immediately stopped work and contacted the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office. Torres arrived at the construction site within an hour, accompanied by crime scene technicians from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The location was approximately 18 miles from Millbrook Elementary, accessible by the same network of logging roads that investigators had searched extensively in the weeks following Sarah's disappearance. The fact that evidence had been found in an area that had already been examined raised disturbing questions about how thoroughly the initial search had been conducted. The buried items included a women's purse that matched descriptions of the handbag Sarah had been carrying on the morning she disappeared, several pieces of jewelry, including a distinctive silver bracelet that Sarah's sister immediately identified as a birth gift she had the previous year. Had been married with being hastily buried without regard for preserving evidence. More significantly, the burial site showed signs of having been disturbed multiple times over the preceding months, as if someone had returned periodically to check on the hidden materials. The soil analysis revealed layers of decomposition that suggested the items had been buried shortly after Sarah's disappearance, then partially excavated and reburied at least twice during the intervening period. Forensic analysis of the recovered items yielded DNA evidence that confirmed the materials belonged to Sarah, but also revealed genetic traces from at least one other individual, whose profile did not match any samples in existing criminal databases. The discovery represented the most significant breakthrough in the case since Sarah's disappearance, but it also raised troubling questions about the killer's ongoing involvement in concealing evidence. Torres coordinated an expanded search of the area using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains that might have been buried for extended periods. The terrain was challenging, with rocky outcroppings and dense undergrowth that could easily conceal additional evidence, but the systematic search revealed nothing beyond the original burial site. The location where Sarah's belongings had been found became the focus of intensive surveillance, as investigators considered the possibility that the perpetrator might return to check on or move the evidence. The remote area was monitored using trail cameras and motion sensors, while unmarked vehicles maintained periodic observation from concealed positions along the access roads. Media coverage of the discovery brought renewed attention to Sarah's case and generated dozens of new tips from individuals who claimed to have seen suspicious activity in the area over the preceding months, but most of the reports proved to be false alarms or cases of mistaken identity that consumed investigative resources without advancing the case. One tip that showed more promise came from a local hunter named Carl Richardson, who reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck parked near the burial site on several occasions during deer season. Richardson was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the area well, and his descriptions of the vehicle's location and timing correlated with the forensic evidence about when the burial site had been disturbed. Richardson's account provided investigators with a more specific timeframe for the perpetrator's visits to the burial site, and suggested that the individual responsible for Sarah's disappearance remained active in the area rather than having fled to another jurisdiction. The implications were both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it suggested the killer could still be caught, but terrifying because it meant he was likely still in the community. Torres began focusing on individuals who possessed the outdoor skills necessary to navigate the remote terrain and the local knowledge required to find such an isolated burial location. The suspect pool included hunters, construction workers, forestry employees, and long-term residents who had grown up exploring the area's back roads and hiking trails. The investigation also revealed that the burial site was located on property owned by Davidson Lumber Company, a regional business that employed dozens of local residents and maintained extensive holdings throughout eastern Tennessee. Company records showed that several employees had legitimate reasons to be familiar with the area, including timber cruisers, equipment operators, and security personnel who monitored against illegal dumping. Among the Davidson Lumber employees who drew Torres' attention was Marcus Webb, a 43-year-old heavy equipment operator who had worked for the company for over 15 years. Webb lived alone in a trailer on family property about 12 miles from Millbrook and had a reputation as a skilled outdoorsman who knew the local terrain better than most longtime residents. Webb's employment records showed that he had been absent from work on the day Sarah disappeared, citing a family emergency that his supervisor had not questioned given Webb's reliable attendance history. But follow-up investigation revealed that the emergency had been fabricated and Webb could not account for his whereabouts during the critical time period. More concerning was Webb's history of inappropriate behavior toward women, including complaints from female coworkers about unwanted attention and several incidents that had resulted in disciplinary action but not termination. Davidson Lumber Company's human resources policies were less comprehensive than those of larger corporations, and Webb's technical skills had apparently outweighed concerns about his interpersonal conduct. The interview with Webb took place at the Rutherford County Sheriff's Office, where Torres was joined by investigators from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Webb appeared nervous but cooperative, initially answering questions about his work schedule and familiarity with the area where Sarah's belongings had been discovered. However, Webb's story began to unravel when Torres pressed him about specific details regarding his claimed family emergency and his knowledge of the remote location where evidence had been found. Webb eventually admitted to having been in the area on multiple occasions, but insisted his visits were related to hunting and recreational activities, rather than anything connected to Sarah's disappearance. The interview concluded without Webb providing a satisfactory explanation for his deceptive behavior or his extensive knowledge of the burial site. Torres obtained a search warrant for Webb's property and vehicle, hoping to discover physical evidence that might definitively link him to Sarah's abduction, but the search revealed only circumstantial evidence, including maps of local logging roads and hunting equipment that could have legitimate purposes. Despite the lack of conclusive evidence, Webb became the primary suspect in Sarah's disappearance, based on his deceptive behavior, his knowledge of the burial site, and his history of inappropriate conduct toward women. But without direct physical evidence linking him to the crime, prosecutors were reluctant to file charges that might not result in conviction. 18 months after the discovery of Sarah Morgan's belongings, Detective Torres received the call that would finally break the case wide open. A new DNA analysis technique developed by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had successfully extracted additional genetic material from evidence that had previously yielded only partial profiles. The enhanced testing revealed not just confirmation of the suspect's identity but evidence of multiple individuals who had handled Sarah's personal items. Dr. Jennifer Coleman, the forensic analyst, who had processed the evidence, explained to Torres that advances in genetic amplification technology now allowed investigators to recover DNA traces from surfaces that had been considered worthless using older methods. Microscopic skin cells, fabric fibers, and even residual genetic material from fingerprints could now be analyzed to create comprehensive profiles suitable for database comparison. The breakthrough came when the enhanced DNA profile was run through the combined DNA index system, revealing a match to genetic material collected during a routine arrest in neighboring Hamilton County 6 months earlier. The suspect, David Allen Foster, had been detained for driving under the influence and had provided a DNA sample as part of standard booking procedures. Foster was a 46-year-old maintenance worker at a regional school district whose employment history included brief stints at several educational institutions throughout eastern Tennessee. His background check revealed a pattern of job changes that coincided with complaints about inappropriate behavior toward female staff members, but no criminal convictions that would have prevented his continued employment in school systems. What made Foster's connection to the case particularly disturbing was his work history at Millbrook Elementary during the summer of 2013. Foster had been part of a maintenance crew that had performed extensive renovations to the school's heating and air conditioning systems. The project had required workers to have access to every classroom, including Sarah's, and had provided Foster with detailed knowledge of the building's layout, security systems, and daily routines. Torres coordinated Foster's arrest with multiple law enforcement agencies, understanding that the suspect had demonstrated sophisticated planning and might attempt to flee if he became aware of the investigation. Foster was taken into custody at his current residence in Chattanooga, where he was working under a slightly modified version of his legal name. The search of Foster's apartment revealed evidence of obsessive behavior that had been developing for over a year before Sarah's disappearance. Hidden in a storage unit that Foster rented under an assumed name, investigators discovered hundreds of photographs taken with telephoto lenses showing Sarah during her daily activities, arriving at school, working in her classroom, and leaving the building after hours. More disturbing was a detailed journal in which Foster had documented Sarah's routines with the precision of someone conducting professional surveillance. Entries described her arrival and departure times, her interactions with colleagues and students, and even her weekend activities at the animal shelter, where Foster had apparently followed her while maintaining careful distance. The journal revealed that Foster had become obsessed with Sarah after observing her during the maintenance project at Millbrook Elementary. His entries described elaborate fantasies about their relationship and growing anger when Sarah failed to acknowledge what he perceived as romantic signals during their brief professional interactions. Perhaps most chilling was Foster's detailed planning for Sarah's abduction, including maps of potential routes, surveillance schedules, and contingency plans for avoiding detection. The journal demonstrated that Sarah's kidnapping had been the result of months of careful preparation, rather than an impulsive crime of opportunity. Foster's confession, when it finally came, revealed the calculated nature of his crimes and the psychological manipulation he had employed to gain access to Sarah on the morning of her disappearance. Foster had returned to Millbrook Elementary claiming to need access to mechanical systems for follow-up maintenance work that had been approved by the district office. Using his familiarity with the school's layout and security procedures, Foster had entered through the side door that he knew would be unlocked during morning arrival times. He had waited in the mechanical room until Sarah was alone in her classroom, then had approached her under the pretense of checking air conditioning vents that he claimed were producing unusual noises. Sarah's trusting nature and her recognition of Foster as someone who had legitimate access to the school had prevented her from immediately recognizing the danger. According to Foster's account, she had been helpful and accommodating, even when he asked her to accompany him to the basement to show him the source of what he claimed were concerning sounds from the ventilation system. The basement of Millbrook Elementary provided the isolation Foster needed to overpower Sarah and remove her from the building through a delivery entrance that was not monitored by security cameras. Foster had used his knowledge of the school's maintenance schedule to ensure their activities would not be interrupted by other staff members or early arriving students. Foster transported Sarah to the remote location, where her belongings were eventually discovered, but his confession revealed that she had survived the initial abduction and had been held alive for several days, while Foster attempted to convince her to participate in the relationship he had constructed in his fantasies. Sarah's resistance to Foster's psychological manipulation had eventually triggered the violence that ended her life, but Foster described her death as the result of an accident that occurred when she attempted to escape, rather than acknowledging the intentional nature of his actions. The location of Sarah's remains continued to be disputed as Foster provided conflicting accounts of how and where he had disposed of her body. Investigators suspected that his inconsistent statements were designed to maintain leverage in plea negotiations while preventing law enforcement from recovering evidence that might reveal additional crimes. Forensic analysis of Foster's vehicle and property revealed trace evidence that corroborated his confession, including soil samples that matched the burial site where Sarah's belongings had been found and fabric fibers that were consistent with clothing Sarah had been wearing on the morning she disappeared. The case that had consumed nearly 2 years of investigative effort and community resources was finally resolved, but the resolution brought more pain than closure as the community learned the details of Sarah's final days and the calculating nature of the predator who had destroyed their sense of safety and trust. The courtroom in Rutherford County was packed beyond capacity on the morning of David Allen Foster's sentencing hearing. Families who had entrusted their children to Millbrook Elementary filled every available seat, while overflow crowds gathered in hallways and outside the courthouse seeking some form of closure for a case that had terrorized their community for nearly 2 years. District Attorney Patricia Reynolds had built her case on 2 years of methodical investigation, understanding that proving Foster's guilt required not just physical evidence but a comprehensive demonstration of the predatory behavior that had led to Sarah's abduction and murder. The prosecution team had assembled over 3,000 pages of documentation, including forensic reports, witness statements, and the detailed journal that revealed Foster's obsessive planning. Foster's defense attorney faced the impossible task of arguing for leniency in a case where the defendant's own writings provided overwhelming evidence of premeditation and psychological manipulation. The strategy focused on mental health issues and claims that Foster had not intended to kill Sarah, but had lost control when his fantasies collided with reality. The victim impact statements dominated 3 full days of proceedings as Sarah's family, colleagues, and students described the ripple effects of her murder on everyone whose life she had touched. Sarah's sister Jennifer Morgan delivered a statement that captured the devastating personal cost of Foster's crimes, while highlighting the broader impact on a community that had lost its innocence. Jennifer described how Sarah had been planning to adopt a child as a single mother, having spent years working with social services to complete the approval process. Sarah had been scheduled to meet her prospective daughter just weeks after her disappearance, a meeting that would never occur because of Foster's selfish obsessions. Principal James Morrison testified about the lasting impact on Millbrook Elementary, where Sarah's empty classroom had become a daily reminder of vulnerability and loss. Morrison described how the school had been forced to implement security measures that fundamentally changed the educational environment, transforming an open, nurturing institution into something resembling a minimum security facility. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the statements from Sarah's former students, who had grown from 8-year-olds into teenagers during the 2 years since her disappearance. Tommy Henderson, now 10 years old, read a letter he had written to his former teacher expressing his confusion about why someone would hurt such a kind person. Madison Parker described how Sarah's encouragement had shaped her academic interests and how losing that support had affected her confidence and motivation. The community impact extended far beyond individual testimonials, as speaker after speaker described how Foster's crimes had shattered the social fabric that had held Millbrook together for generations. Neighbor no longer trusted neighbor. Parents questioned every adult who worked with children, and the easy familiarity that had defined small-town life was replaced by constant vigilance and suspicion. Pastor William Clark testified about the spiritual crisis that Sarah's murder had created within his congregation, describing how many longtime members had struggled with questions about divine protection and the existence of evil in their previously safe community. Church attendance had actually increased following Sarah's disappearance, but worship services were marked by an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty that had never existed before. Business owners described the economic impact as Millbrook's reputation for safety was replaced by association with violent crime. Tourism declined, property values fluctuated, and new business development stalled as potential investors expressed concerns about security. Real estate agent Martha Stevens testified that several longtime residents had relocated to other communities, unable to rebuild their sense of safety in a place where such horror had occurred. The medical testimony provided clinical details about Foster's psychological condition that helped explain but not excuse his criminal behavior. Dr. Robert Hayes, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Foster, described classic patterns of obsessive behavior that had escalated over months of surveillance and fantasy development. According to Dr. Hayes, Foster suffered from a combination of personality disorders that made him incapable of forming normal relationships, while creating elaborate internal narratives about romantic connections that existed only in his imagination. Sarah's professional kindness during their brief interactions at the school had been misinterpreted as personal interest, triggering an escalation of obsessive behavior that culminated in abduction and murder. The psychiatrist's testimony revealed that Foster had engaged in similar stalking behavior toward other women throughout his adult life, but had never before escalated to physical violence. The combination of access opportunity and Sarah's specific vulnerabilities had created what Dr. Hayes described as a perfect storm of factors that enabled Foster to act on his violent fantasies. Foster's own statement to the court lasted less than 5 minutes and provided no meaningful acknowledgement of responsibility or expression of genuine remorse. He claimed that Sarah's death had been accidental and maintained that his intentions had been romantic rather than violent. His inability to accept accountability for the calculated nature of his crimes added an additional layer of frustration for victims' families seeking some form of meaningful closure. Judge Patricia Moore had presided over criminal cases for over 20 years, but few had affected her as personally as Foster's trial. The combination of meticulous planning, victim vulnerability, and community impact created a case that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior, extending into realms of psychological terrorism that had affected thousands of people. Judge Moore's sentencing remarks acknowledged the inadequacy of legal punishment when measured against the scope of damage that Foster had inflicted on Sarah, her family, and the broader Millbrook community. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole represented the maximum penalty available under Tennessee law, but seemed insufficient when compared to the lifetime of grief that Sarah's family would endure. The sentence also included restitution orders that required Foster to compensate the Morgan family for funeral expenses, counseling costs, and lost income, though everyone understood that no amount of money could address the true cost of Sarah's murder. The financial penalties were largely symbolic given Foster's lack of assets, but they provided legal recognition of the economic impact his crimes had created. Media coverage of the sentencing hearing brought national attention to Millbrook's struggle with healing and recovery as other small communities grappled with similar questions about trust, safety, and the capacity of seemingly normal individuals to commit horrific crimes. The case became a subject of academic study in criminology and psychology programs examining how predators exploit institutional access and community trust. Law enforcement officials used Foster's case to advocate for enhanced background screening procedures for school employees and improved coordination between educational institutions when hiring decisions were made. The revelation that Foster had been able to move between school districts despite complaints about inappropriate behavior highlighted systemic failures in protecting children from predators who exploited educational environments. The Millbrook School Board implemented comprehensive policy changes requiring psychological evaluations for all maintenance and support staff, conducting more thorough background investigations, and establishing protocols for reporting and investigating behavioral concerns. The changes were expensive and time-consuming but represented the community's commitment to preventing similar tragedies. Child protection advocates incorporated lessons from Sarah's case into training programs emphasizing the importance of recognizing grooming behaviors and trusting instincts about adults who seemed overly interested in children or who violated normal boundaries even in professional contexts. The case demonstrated how predators could exploit institutional authority and community trust while maintaining facades of respectability. The ripple effects of Foster's crimes continued long after his imprisonment as Millbrook struggled to rebuild its sense of community, while maintaining the vigilance necessary to protect its children. The challenge lay in finding balance between reasonable caution and the paralyzing fear that had initially followed Sarah's disappearance. Healing required acknowledgement that complete safety was impossible while rejecting the cynicism that would prevent future trust and community building. The process was ongoing years after Foster's conviction as residents worked to honor Sarah's memory, while creating a new version of their community that incorporated hard-earned lessons about human nature and institutional responsibility. 3 years after David Allen Foster's conviction, Millbrook began the slow process of rebuilding trust and community identity, while incorporating the painful lessons learned from Sarah Morgan's murder. The healing process proved to be more complex than anyone had anticipated, requiring not just time but deliberate efforts to address the psychological and social wounds that Foster's crimes had inflicted on the entire community. Millbrook Elementary underwent comprehensive renovations that transformed both its physical appearance and security infrastructure. The project, funded through a combination of state grants, insurance settlements, and community fundraising, created a modern educational facility that balanced safety requirements with the open, nurturing environment that had made the school special. Sarah's former classroom became a multimedia learning center, named in her honor, featuring technology resources that would have excited her passion for innovative teaching methods. The space served both as memorial and functional educational facility, ensuring that her legacy lived on through continued service to students, rather than becoming a shrine to tragedy. Principal James Morrison, who had considered early retirement in the aftermath of Sarah's murder, chose to remain and lead the school's transformation into a model for rural educational security. His leadership helped staff and families navigate the difficult balance between necessary vigilance and the trust required for effective education. The Sarah Morgan Memorial Scholarship Fund, established by community donations, provided annual awards to local students pursuing careers in education. The scholarships were designed to attract dedicated teachers who shared Sarah's commitment to nurturing young minds, while ensuring that her passion for learning would continue to influence future generations. Psychological counseling services expanded significantly throughout Rutherford County as mental health professionals recognized the widespread trauma that violent crime inflicted on small communities. Many residents had never before experienced the need for professional mental health support, but learned to accept counseling as necessary maintenance for emotional well-being rather than a sign of weakness. Children who had been Sarah's students received ongoing support to process their loss and develop healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with tragedy. Several went on to pursue careers in education or child advocacy, inspired by their memories of her influence on their early development. Tommy Henderson, who had struggled with selective mutism following Sarah's disappearance, gradually regained his confidence through specialized therapy that helped him understand that bad things could happen to good people without undermining the fundamental safety of his world. His recovery became a source of hope for other families dealing with trauma-related behavioral changes. Madison Parker channeled her intellectual gifts into advocacy work, establishing a peer counseling program at Millbrook High School that provided support for students dealing with various forms of trauma. Her early experience with loss had developed her empathy and leadership skills in ways that benefited the entire student body. Law enforcement throughout eastern Tennessee implemented enhanced protocols for investigating crimes against educators, recognizing that attacks on teachers represented threats to entire communities, rather than just individual victims. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation created specialized units trained to understand the unique dynamics of school-based crimes. Detective Michael Torres received recognition for his persistent investigation of Sarah's case, but emphasized that the resolution had required collaboration between multiple agencies and community cooperation that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement efforts. His experience with the case influenced training programs for rural investigators dealing with complex crimes. Religious communities throughout the region grappled with theological questions about divine protection and human evil that Sarah's murder had raised. Pastor William Clark worked with other clergy to develop counseling approaches that acknowledged the reality of suffering while maintaining faith in ultimate meaning and purpose. The annual Sarah Morgan Memorial Service became a cornerstone of Millbrook's community calendar, bringing together current and former residents to remember her life while celebrating the positive changes that had emerged from tragedy. The services featured musical performances by students and community members honoring Sarah's love of creativity and artistic expression. Business leaders recognized that Millbrook's recovery required economic development that could provide opportunities for young people who might otherwise leave for larger cities. The community worked to attract technology companies and light manufacturing that could offer careers requiring education and training while maintaining the small-town values that residents cherished. Real estate values stabilized as Millbrook developed a reputation for proactive community safety rather than simply being known as the site of a tragic crime. New residents were attracted by the school's enhanced security measures and the tight-knit community bonds that had been strengthened rather than weakened by shared adversity. The annual Peach Festival expanded to include safety awareness components that educated families about recognizing predatory behavior and protecting children while maintaining the celebratory atmosphere that made the event special. Community leaders learned to address serious topics without creating paralyzing fear. Foster's crimes had revealed institutional weaknesses in background screening and employee monitoring that extended far beyond Millbrook Elementary. School districts throughout Tennessee implemented enhanced hiring procedures that included psychological evaluations, ongoing supervision, and improved communication systems for reporting concerning behavior. Parent-teacher associations became more involved in school security discussions while maintaining focus on educational excellence. The challenge lay in implementing appropriate safety measures without creating institutional atmospheres that interfered with learning and child development. Volunteer organizations proliferated as residents sought constructive ways to channel their concerns about community safety into positive action. Neighborhood watch programs, youth mentoring initiatives, and senior citizen support networks strengthened social connections while providing informal monitoring of community well-being. The Millbrook Historical Society documented the community's response to Sarah tragedy as part of its ongoing record of local events, ensuring that future generations would understand both the horror of her murder and the resilience demonstrated by residents who refused to allow fear to destroy their way of life. Mental health awareness became integrated into school curricula at all levels as educators recognized that emotional intelligence and coping skills were as important as traditional academic subjects. Students learned to identify signs of depression, anxiety, and trauma in themselves and peers while developing communication skills for seeking appropriate help. Community gardens established in Sarah's memory provided opportunities for residents to work together on projects that beautified Millbrook while creating informal networks for mutual support and monitoring. The gardens became gathering places where neighbors could maintain social connections that had been strained by suspicion and fear. Support groups for families affected by violent crime expanded beyond Millbrook to serve rural communities throughout eastern Tennessee that lacked resources for dealing with trauma. The programs developed expertise in addressing the unique challenges faced by small towns where everyone knows everyone and traditional anonymity is impossible. Youth sports leagues implemented enhanced safety protocols that balanced child protection with the community-building aspects of athletic participation. Coaches received training in recognizing inappropriate behavior, while maintaining the mentoring relationships that made sports valuable for character development. The legacy of Sarah Morgan's murder and the community's response became a case study used by emergency management professionals and community development specialists to understand how rural areas could build resilience against various forms of trauma while maintaining the social cohesion that made small-town life attractive. Millbrook's experience demonstrated that communities could recover from devastating crimes without losing their essential character, but that recovery required deliberate effort, ongoing commitment, and recognition that complete safety was impossible, while meaningful security was achievable through collective vigilance and mutual support. 5 years after Sarah Morgan's murder, Millbrook had evolved from a community defined by tragedy into one strengthened by its response to adversity. The changes went far beyond enhanced security measures to encompass a deeper understanding of human nature, institutional responsibility, and the ongoing work required to maintain safe, nurturing environments for children and families. David Allen Foster remained imprisoned at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, where he was serving his life sentence without possibility of parole. His appeals had been exhausted and psychological evaluations conducted during his incarceration confirmed that he continued to pose a significant threat to public safety, particularly to women and children. Prison officials reported that Foster showed no genuine remorse for his crimes and maintained the delusional belief that his relationship with Sarah had been romantic rather than predatory. His inability to accept responsibility for his actions reinforced the appropriateness of his life sentence, while providing closure for those who had feared he might eventually be released. The Sarah Morgan Foundation, established by her family, had grown into a regional organization providing scholarships, training programs, and support services for educators throughout eastern Tennessee. The foundation's work ensured that Sarah's passion for teaching continued to influence educational practices while creating positive change that honored her memory. Millbrook Elementary had become a model for rural school security, serving as a training site for educators and law enforcement professionals learning to implement safety measures that protected children without creating institutional atmospheres that interfered with learning. The school's success demonstrated that appropriate precautions could enhance rather than diminish educational effectiveness. Detective Michael Torres had been promoted to chief of police in a neighboring county where he implemented investigation protocols developed during Sarah's case. His experience had shown that rural law enforcement could successfully handle complex crimes when proper resources, training, and interagency cooperation were available. The enhanced background screening procedures pioneered in Millbrook had been adopted throughout Tennessee and had prevented several potentially dangerous individuals from gaining access to educational environments. The systemic changes represented Sarah's lasting contribution to child safety, extending far beyond her own community. Psychological support services that had been established in response to community trauma had evolved into comprehensive mental health programs, serving rural populations that had previously lacked access to professional counseling. The services addressed not just crisis intervention, but ongoing wellness support that helped individuals and families develop resilience against various life challenges. Tommy Henderson had graduated high school with honors and planned to pursue a teaching degree, inspired by his memories of Sarah's encouragement during his elementary years. His recovery from trauma-related difficulties demonstrated the long-term effectiveness of appropriate intervention and support. Madison Parker had received a full scholarship to Vanderbilt University, where she planned to study psychology and education. Her early experience with loss had developed her empathy and academic interests in ways that would benefit future students who might face similar challenges. Pastor William Clark had written a book about maintaining faith during times of crisis, using Millbrook's experience to help other communities and individuals dealing with tragic events. His work had been recognized by denominational leaders and had influenced pastoral training programs throughout the region. The annual Sarah Morgan Memorial Service had evolved into a celebration of educational excellence and community resilience, drawing participants from throughout eastern Tennessee. The event featured scholarship presentations, teacher recognition ceremonies, and workshops on child safety that provided practical benefit while honoring Sarah's memory. Local businesses had recovered from the initial economic impact of Sarah's murder and had actually prospered as Millbrook developed a reputation for proactive community development and strong educational institutions. New families were attracted by the enhanced safety measures and tight-knit social networks. Real estate development had resumed with careful attention to maintaining the rural character that made Millbrook attractive while providing modern amenities and security features that contemporary families expected. The community had learned to balance growth with preservation of values. Law enforcement agencies throughout Tennessee had implemented training programs based on lessons learned from Sarah's case, emphasizing the importance of thorough background investigations, interagency cooperation, and community engagement in preventing and solving crimes against educators. The Tennessee legislature had passed enhanced penalties for crimes committed against school personnel, recognizing that attacks on educators represented threats to entire communities. The legislation was named in Sarah's honor and had been used to prosecute several cases involving violence against teachers. School districts statewide had adopted hiring procedures that included psychological evaluations, reference investigations, and ongoing supervision designed to identify and prevent employment of individuals who might pose threats to students or staff. The changes had been expensive but had prevented numerous potential incidents. Community organizations established in response to Sarah's murder had continued their work long after the immediate crisis had passed. Neighborhood watch programs, youth mentoring initiatives, and senior citizen support networks had strengthened social connections while providing informal monitoring systems that enhanced overall security. Mental health awareness had become integrated into educational curricula, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to recognize and address psychological problems that could lead to violence. Students learned communication skills, emotional regulation techniques, and help-seeking behaviors that provided protection against various forms of trauma. The Millbrook model of community response to violent crime had been studied by researchers and implemented by other rural areas facing similar challenges. The approach emphasized healing through collective action rather than retreat into isolation, while maintaining appropriate vigilance against future threats. Foster's case had contributed to academic research on predatory behavior and institutional vulnerability, helping professionals understand how individuals with psychological disorders could exploit positions of trust and access. The research had influenced employee screening procedures in educational, healthcare, and youth service organizations. Support networks for families affected by violent crime had expanded beyond Millbrook to serve rural communities throughout the region that lacked resources for trauma counseling. The programs provided both immediate crisis intervention and long-term support for dealing with legal proceedings and healing processes. Youth programs had been enhanced to include safety education that taught children to recognize dangerous situations and seek help from trusted adults, while maintaining the open, trusting attitudes necessary for healthy social development. The curricula balanced protection with age-appropriate information. The physical memorial to Sarah, located in the town square, featured a bronze plaque that described her contributions to education, while emphasizing the community values of learning, growth, and mutual support that she had embodied. The memorial served as both remembrance and inspiration for continued commitment to those ideals. Millbrook's recovery demonstrated that communities could emerge stronger from traumatic events when they channeled grief into constructive action and refused to allow fear to destroy the social bonds that made small-town life meaningful. The process required time, patience, and ongoing commitment, but had ultimately created a more resilient and aware community. The broader impact of Sarah's case continued to influence educational policy, criminal justice procedures, and community development approaches throughout Tennessee and beyond. Her legacy lived on not just through individual memories but through systemic changes that protected countless children and families. A decade after Sarah Morgan's murder, Millbrook had transformed from a community defined by tragedy into a model for rural resilience and educational excellence. The changes implemented in response to her death had created lasting improvements that extended far beyond the original crisis, touching every aspect of community life and influencing policy development throughout Tennessee. Millbrook Elementary had earned recognition as one of the state's outstanding rural schools, combining innovative educational programs with comprehensive safety measures that protected students without compromising the nurturing environment that made learning effective. Principal Morrison had retired and been replaced by Dreer Jennifer Collins, a former student of Sarah's who had been inspired to pursue educational leadership. The Sarah Morgan Center for Educational Excellence, housed within the renovated elementary school, served as a training facility for teachers throughout eastern Tennessee, providing professional development programs that emphasized both academic achievement and student safety. The center had trained over 500 educators who carried Sarah's legacy into classrooms across multiple counties. Community-based mental health services had expanded into a regional network, providing counseling support to rural populations that had historically lacked access to professional psychological care. The services addressed not only crisis intervention, but preventive mental wellness programs that helped individuals and families build resilience against various life challenges. Detective work in rural areas had been revolutionized by protocols developed during Sarah's investigation. Small police departments throughout the region now had access to training programs that emphasized interagency cooperation, advanced forensic techniques, and community engagement strategies that had proven effective in solving complex crimes. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had established satellite offices in rural areas, ensuring that sophisticated investigative resources were available when needed rather than requiring local departments to handle major crimes with inadequate tools and training. The expansion had prevented numerous cases from going cold due to resource limitations. Educational security had become a specialized field with professionals trained to understand both law enforcement procedures and child development. Millbrook Elementary employed one of the first certified educational safety coordinators whose expertise had been sought by school districts nationwide. Background screening for school employees had evolved into comprehensive evaluation systems that included psychological assessments, reference investigations, and ongoing supervision designed to identify potential threats before they could access educational environments. The procedures had prevented dozens of potentially dangerous individuals from working with children. Tommy Henderson had become Millbrook's youngest principal at age 28, leading the middle school, where he implemented programs designed to help students navigate the challenging transition from elementary to high school. His own experience overcoming trauma had given him unique insights into supporting children facing various difficulties. Madison Parker had established a nonprofit research organization focused on trauma-informed educational practices. Her work had influenced teacher training programs throughout the country, while providing evidence-based approaches for helping children affected by violence, domestic instability, and other adverse experiences. The annual Sarah Morgan Memorial Conference had grown into the largest educational safety event in the Southeast, drawing over 3,000 participants, including teachers, administrators, law enforcement officers, and mental health professionals. The conference generated significant economic activity for Millbrook while advancing knowledge in multiple professional fields. Community mental health services pioneered in Millbrook had been replicated throughout rural America, providing counseling and support services to populations that had historically lacked access to professional care. The model demonstrated that comprehensive mental health programs could be economically sustainable in small communities. Law enforcement training based on Sarah's case had influenced police academy curricula throughout the United States, emphasizing community cooperation, systematic investigation techniques, and the unique challenges of rural crime solving. The training had improved clearance rates for violent crimes in small jurisdictions nationwide. Millbrook's economic development had attracted technology companies and light manufacturing that provided high-paying jobs while preserving the town's rural character. The community had achieved the difficult balance of growth and preservation that many small towns struggled to maintain. Educational security had evolved into a recognized professional specialty, with practitioners trained to understand both law enforcement procedures and child development. Millbrook Elementary employed one of the first certified educational safety coordinators, whose expertise had been sought by school districts nationwide. Foster remained in prison, where his case continued to be studied by forensic psychologists and criminal justice researchers. His detailed journals and behavioral patterns had contributed to understanding of predatory development, while helping professionals identify warning signs in other potentially dangerous individuals. The Tennessee legislature had passed comprehensive education safety legislation, known as the Sarah Morgan Act, requiring enhanced background screening, ongoing supervision, and mandatory reporting protocols for all school employees. The law had been used as a model by other states and had prevented numerous incidents nationwide. Victim services in rural areas had been revolutionized by programs developed in Millbrook's aftermath. Small communities throughout Tennessee now had access to professional advocates, legal support, and counseling services that helped families navigate the criminal justice system while beginning healing processes. Religious communities throughout the region had incorporated trauma-informed pastoral care into their ministry training programs. Pastor Clark's book about maintaining faith during crisis had become required reading in several seminaries, while providing practical guidance for clergy supporting congregations through difficult times. School architecture had been influenced by safety innovations first implemented at Millbrook Elementary. The building design balanced security requirements with educational effectiveness, creating environments that felt safe without resembling fortresses. Architects specializing in educational facilities now studied Millbrook's approach. Youth development programs throughout eastern Tennessee had adopted comprehensive safety education that taught children to recognize dangerous situations while maintaining the trust and openness necessary for healthy social development. The curricula had been adapted for various age groups and cultural contexts. Community policing initiatives that strengthened relationships between law enforcement and residents had reduced crime rates while improving quality of life throughout the region. The approach demonstrated that public safety was most effective when based on mutual trust and cooperation. Research conducted by universities throughout the Southeast had documented Millbrook's recovery process, providing evidence-based models for community resilience that had been applied in response to various forms of trauma, including natural disasters, economic disruption, and other violent crimes. International attention had brought delegations from countries seeking to understand American approaches to rural education and community safety. Millbrook's experience had influenced educational policy and law enforcement training in several nations while contributing to global discussions about child protection. The physical memorial to Sarah in Millbrook's town square had been expanded to include an interactive educational display that taught visitors about recognizing and preventing violence, while honoring the memory of all educators who had made ultimate sacrifices in service to their students. Foster had died in prison the previous year, eliminating any possibility of future release while providing final closure to a case that had defined Millbrook's transformation. His death had been marked by quiet acknowledgement, rather than celebration, as community leaders emphasized healing over revenge. Legislative advocacy inspired by Sarah's case had influenced federal education policy, including increased funding for rural schools, enhanced teacher training programs, and improved coordination between educational institutions and law enforcement agencies. The changes had benefited millions of students nationwide. Professional development programs for educators now routinely included content about recognizing potential threats and protecting students while maintaining supportive learning environments. The training had become standard practice throughout American education, helping prevent violence while fostering positive school climates. Millbrook's success had attracted media attention that highlighted positive aspects of rural life, while demonstrating that small communities could respond effectively to major challenges. The coverage had countered negative stereotypes about rural areas while inspiring similar communities facing their own difficulties. The broader impact of Sarah's case continued to influence academic research, policy development, and professional practice long after the immediate crisis had passed. Her legacy lived on through systemic changes that protected countless children while advancing understanding of violence prevention and community resilience. 15 years later, Millbrook stood as proof that communities could emerge stronger from devastating experiences when they channeled grief into constructive action, refused to succumb to fear, and maintained commitment to the values that made their way of life worth preserving. If you have followed this investigation from the beginning, share your thoughts about how communities can balance safety with trust and openness. What warning signs might help identify potential predators in positions of authority, and how can we honor victims' memories while building stronger protective systems for future generations? Subscribe for more stories that examine how ordinary communities respond to extraordinary challenges, and never forget that sometimes the most important battles for justice are fought not in courtrooms but in the daily work of rebuilding faith, hope, and human connection.